Rome wasn't built in a day, but it was destroyed in one. The great city was pillaged and razed to the ground by armies from the north, sacked by rival kings, and eventually overrun by nature itself. However, there were times in Rome's long history where no outside force was needed to tear the city down, because the citizens could do that all by themselves. From emperors to common folk, Romans loved nothing more than watching people squirm in pain and agony. And there was no better place to see these spectacles than the bloody torture chambers of the Roman Empire. Let's get into it. Emperor Nero, the infamous leader who fiddled while Rome burned, is said to have had a personal torture chamber with 8 different themed rooms. But this was nothing compared to the torturous attractions at the public dungeon. At the entrance, visitors would pass through a gate made from the teeth and bones of previous victims, and then make their way through a series of chambers. The first was the hanging room, where condemned criminals would be left to slowly choke as they dangled from the ceiling. The second room over was even worse. Here, criminals would be sewn up in leather sacks, along with snakes, rats, and other animals for an excruciatingly slow death. If the victim was particularly stubborn, the executioner would use a red-hot musket ball to bust them open. The third chamber was reserved for crucifixion, a punishment so painful that many victims died before even reaching the cross. The condemned would be stripped, tied, and flogged until every inch of their body was covered in blood and torn flesh. They would then be left out in the sun for days, slowly losing their minds under the scorching heat. When their bodies were finally broken, they would be nailed to the cross and left to die. In the fourth room, criminals would be placed inside hollowed-out chariots like horses and whipped as they pulled executioners around. The fifth chamber was for women only, where they would be locked inside metal boxes without food or water until they starved to death. The sixth room was used for burning, either slowly roasting criminals over an open flame or sealing them inside a burning chamber made of resin and flax. The seventh was reserved for decapitation, where the condemned would be led into a pit and beheaded in front of a crowd. Finally, the eighth and final chamber was used for impalement. Victims would be pinned to wooden stakes and left to die of exposure, often with their entrails spilling out of their torn stomachs. All of these punishments could be witnessed from the comfort of Nero's private viewing room, complete with a bar and refreshments. It was the perfect way to spend an afternoon in ancient Rome. One of the most common forms of capital punishment was crucifixion, popular across the Roman world as a warning to would-be criminals. For the unlucky souls sentenced to this fate, the ordeal began well before the hammer and nails came out. The victims as torment began when they were stripped naked and tied to a cross-shaped frame called a crux simplex. This contraption was designed to break the person's bones and inflict maximum suffering. While tied up, the victim would be flogged with a whip called a flagellum, made of leather thongs and metal studs. The back was the main target, but the scourge was often applied liberally everywhere else. Once the victim was bloodied and broken, they would be dragged to a nearby hill where a single nail awaited them. In a cruel twist of fate, this nail was bent, forcing the victim to spread their arms wide as they were hoisted onto the cross. Other nails would be driven through their wrists and ankles, securing them in place. As a final humiliation, the executioners would strip the victim once more, not bothering to remove the remnants of the flogging, and leave them exposed for all to see. Now immobilized and in excruciating pain, the victim would be left to die of exhaustion and exposure. Crucifixion was a public spectacle meant to terrify onlookers into avoiding a life of crime. Another favored method of torture was using thumbscrews. This form of punishment was reserved for those who fell afoul of Roman law, such as counterfeiters, con artists, and pirates. They were considered dangerous to the social order and were dealt with accordingly. The thumbscrew consisted of a wooden screw and a metal collar that would be tightened around the victim's ass, hand, or foot. As the screw was turned, the bones were crushed and mangled, causing intense pain and permanent disability. Those unfortunate enough to endure this punishment often died from infection and gangrene. Hanging was another common form of capital punishment in ancient Rome. It was used for crimes ranging from murder to treason and was seen as a quick and easy way to deal with criminals. The executioners would use a variety of methods to hang their victims, such as the simple drop, where the rope was tied around the neck and the victim was dropped from a height, or the long drop, where the rope was suspended from a high beam and the victim was allowed to dangle, slowly breaking their neck. There were also more elaborate methods, such as the crucifixion by hanging, where the victim's hands were tied behind their back and their feet were nailed to a crosspiece, making it impossible for them to escape the noose. The choice of method depended on the severity of the crime and the status of the victim. For example, prominent figures such as senators and priests were often given the more humane drop, while common criminals were subjected to more brutal methods. Hanging was a public spectacle, and the condemned would often be paraded through the streets before their execution. Spectators would jeer and throw objects at them as they passed, making it a humiliating end to their lives. Roman emperors took great pleasure in the suffering of others and often unleashed their wrath on those who opposed them. One emperor, Caligula, chained chariots to chariots and whipped prisoners as they pulled him around. Another, Commodus, chained his victims to chariots like horses and whipped them as they pulled him around. He also hosted hunting parties where he unleashed poisonous snakes into the audience at the gladiator games and watched with amusement as the crowds panicked and fell victim to poisonous bites. The most infamous of all, however, was Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor who wrote the famous Meditations. But this stoic leader had a dark side. He presided over a reign of terror and cruelty, persecuting Christians, Jews, and anyone else who didn't conform to his vision of Roman society. He delighted in public executions and once unleashed poisonous snakes into the audience at the gladiator games, watching with amusement as the crowds panicked and fell victim to poisonous bites. While these methods may seem brutal and inhumane today, they were commonplace in the ancient world. Ancient Rome was a violent and chaotic place, and these acts of cruelty were seen as necessary to maintain order and control. The Roman people were desensitized to violence and thrived on the spectacle of human suffering. Today, we can look back on these practices and shake our heads in disbelief. However, it is important to remember that this was the reality of life in ancient Rome, and understanding this helps us gain a deeper appreciation for the complexities of the Roman Empire. As we continue to explore the gruesome world of ancient Roman torture, it's essential to remember that these acts of cruelty were not merely historical curiosities, but rather a reflection of the values and beliefs of the time. By gaining a deeper understanding of the mindset of the Romans, we can better comprehend why they inflicted such horrible punishments and what role these practices played in their society. We must also acknowledge that while the Roman Empire is often celebrated for its achievements in art, architecture, and law, it was also capable of great brutality and oppression. By learning about the dark side of Roman history, we can gain a more balanced perspective on this complex civilization and the lasting impact it has had on our world. Thanks for watching.